Okay, so it feels like you can't really avoid hearing about plastics these days, in the ocean, in our food.
Everywhere, yeah. Even in the air we're breathing.
Exactly. And we've sort of known about microplastics for a while now, but the idea that they're actually showing up inside our bodies,
Yeah.
that's becoming clearer. And honestly, it's raising some pretty serious questions.
Absolutely. I mean,
Sure.
these materials are just so widespread in the environment now, it's almost inevitable scientists will start asking, okay, are they getting into us? Are they building up? And crucially, what could that mean for our health?
And that leads us right into today's deep dive. We've got this really interesting, and I have to say, maybe a little unsettling piece of research.
Yeah.
We're going to dig into a scientific paper. It's titled Bioaccumulation of Microplastics in Decedent Human Brains.
Ah, okay. Yeah, this kind of study is a big step, really, trying to understand just how deep these tiny plastic particles are getting into our systems and focusing specifically on, really crucial organs.
Right. And look, you listening might have caught a headline here or there about microplastics, but we want to go, much deeper than just a soundbite.
Get into the details.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really try and understand the key findings from this paper, think about what they might mean for health, and also, importantly, figure out what we still don't know. We want to give you the full picture, or as full as we can get right now.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. When we say microplastics, and they also mention nanoplastics, what exactly are we talking about here, size-wise?
Right. So the study lumps them together sometimes as MNPs, micronanoplastics. They're basically tiny bits of polymer, the stuff plastics are made of.
Okay.
And the size range is huge. It goes from about 500 micrometers, that's like half a millimeter, visible perhaps, all the way down to 1 nanometer.
Whoa, 1 nanometer. That's incredibly small.
That's unbelievably small, a billionth of a meter. So yeah, especially the nanoplastics, we're talking minuscule.
And the paper highlights that the amount of this stuff, these MNPs, in the environment has just exploded over the last 50 years or so.
It really has.
Yeah.
An exponential increase, they call it. And when you see that kind of rise in something synthetic in the environment, you naturally start worrying about, well, how much are we being exposed to?
Yeah.
And what could it be doing?
And we have actually seen some potential links already, haven't we, between these particles and health problems? I think the paper mentioned some previous work.
Yes, exactly. Some earlier studies have suggested a connection between finding MNPs in the plaque that can build up in our arteries, the carotid arteries in the neck, and seeing more inflammation there. And there's also been a potential link observed with a higher risk of serious cardiovascular events like heart attacks or strokes.
Okay, that's already quite concerning. But what this new study really seems to tackle is that we didn't have a great picture of where exactly these plastics go in the body and how much is actually sticking around.
Precisely. We knew or had evidence they could get into the lungs, the gut, even the placenta. But the methods used before, they often could only detect the slightly larger particles, maybe bigger than 5 micrometers.
Ah, so they might have been missing the really tiny ones, the nanos.
Exactly. The nanoplastics could have just been slipping through the net, so to speak. They didn't have a good way to measure them accurately across different tissues.
So, okay, this new study needed a better tool, a better method to find these things, especially the super small ones. What did they use?
They used a technique that's quite sophisticated called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. Let's just call it PyGCMS.
Okay, PyGCMS. Catchy.
Yeah. But basically think of it as a really advanced way to not just find the plastic particles, but also to figure out what kind of plastic it is and how much is there. It gives a much more quantitative and less biased picture than some older methods. They combine this with some visualization techniques too.
Got it. So more complete, more accurate. And they looked at specific samples, right, from particular organs and years.
Yes. They analyzed human tissue samples collected after death, post-mortem samples. They looked at liver, kidney, and brain tissue, specifically the frontal cortex of the brain, which is involved in, thinking, decision-making.
Right. Important stuff.
Very. And the samples were from people who passed away in 2016 and more recently in 2024.
Okay, so they've got the samples, they've got this PyGCMS method. What did they find? Overall, were the plastics there? How much?
Yes, they confirmed MNPs were present in all 3 organs, kidney, liver, and brain. That's the first big finding.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is that in the liver and kidney samples from 2024, the amounts were pretty similar. The median concentration was around 400 micrograms per gram of tissue.
400 micrograms per gram. That's hard to picture, but it sounds like a measurable amount accumulating in those organs.
It is. You have to imagine these tiny, tiny particles adding up within the tissue itself.
But the brain was different, wasn't it?
It was very different. The MNP concentrations they found in the brain samples were significantly higher than in the liver or kidney.
How much higher?
Okay, so the median level in the brain samples from 2016 was around 3,345 micrograms per gram. And in the 2024 samples, it went up to about 4,917 micrograms per gram.
Wow. That's what, like 10 times higher, roughly, than the liver and kidney in 2024?
Something like that, yeah. It's a huge difference. The brain seems to be accumulating these particles much more intensely.
And they double-checked this, right, with some independent analysis?
They did. They had 5 of the 2016 brain samples analyzed by a different lab at Oklahoma State University, and those results backed up what the main team at the University of New Mexico found. So that gives you more confidence in the numbers.
Definitely. Okay, so they're there. Much higher levels in the brain. What about the type of plastic? Was it all the same stuff?
Mostly, yes. The dominant type they found was polyethylene, or PE.
PE, that's like really common plastic, right? Shopping bags, film.
Exactly. One of the most widely produced plastics globally, found in tons of packaging.
And was the mix of plastics the same in all the organs?
Not quite. While PE was the major player everywhere, the brain tissue had an even higher proportion of it. On average, about 75% of the total plastic mass they measured in the brain was PE.
75% PE in the brain. So it seems the brain is really holding on to that specific type.
It appears that way, yeah.
Were there other plastics that seemed to be increasing over time, too, between 2016 and 2024?
Yes, they specifically noted increases not just for PE, but also for polypropylene, that's PP, used in things like yogurt pots and containers.
Right.
Polyvinyl chloride, PVC, pipes, some packaging. And also styrene butadiene rubber, SBR, which is common in tires. The levels of all of those specifically went up in both the liver and the brain samples between 2016 and 2024.
So it's not just one type, it's a range of common plastics that seem to be building up more over that period.
That's what the data suggests, yeah, a rising burden.
This really points towards, ongoing accumulation. Did they look further back to see if this is a recent thing or if it's been happening for longer?
They did manage to do that, which is really interesting. They got hold of some older brain tissue samples from tissue banks on the U.S. East Coast. These dated from 1997 up to 2013.
Okay, so going back further.
Exactly. And when they analyzed those older samples, they generally found lower overall MNP concentrations compared to the more recent New Mexico samples from 2016 and 2024.
So lower levels back then.
Yeah. Now, they acknowledged there could be geographical differences playing a role, East Coast versus Southwest U.S.
Sure.
But even accounting for that possibility, it strongly points towards a trend of increasing accumulation in the brain over the last couple of decades.
Okay, so the trend seems to be upwards over time. How big was the jump just between 2016 and 2024 in the brain samples they looked at?
They reported roughly a 50% increase in the total plastic mass concentration in the brain just in that 8-year window.
50%.
In 8 years?
Yeah. It suggests a pretty rapid increase in accumulation in the brain in recent times. It really does paint a stark picture. Wow. Okay, that's significant.
Yeah.
Now, one of the findings that I think probably got the most attention or is maybe the most concerning was a link they found with dementia. Can you tell us about that part?
Yes, this was a really striking observation. Again, I need to stress, it's an association they found, not proof of cause and effect yet.
Right. Important distinction.
Very important. But what they saw was that in a specific group of individuals in their study who had documented diagnoses of dementia before they passed away, their brains showed significantly higher levels of MNPs.
How much higher are we talking?
The median concentration in the dementia cohort was around 26,076 micrograms per gram.
26,000 compared to the, roughly 5,000 in the general 2024 samples?
Exactly. So, 5 times higher, maybe more. It's a dramatically higher level of accumulation in the brains of people with dementia in this particular group.
That is a huge difference. Did they see where these plastics were located within the brain in those cases?
They did note a particular presence of these MNPs within the walls of the blood vessels in the brain, the cerebrovascular walls, and also inside certain immune cells within the brain tissue itself in those dementia cases.
But again, just to be super clear, this doesn't prove the plastics cause the dementia.
Absolutely not. And the researchers are very clear about this too. They point out several factors common in dementia, like the brain shrinking, which is called atrophy, or potentially a weakened blood-brain barrier, or maybe the brain just isn't clearing out waste materials, including these plastics, as effectively. Any of those could potentially lead to higher MNP levels being measured.
So the plastics could be accumulating because of the dementia rather than causing it, or it could be more complex.
Precisely. It could be a consequence or part of a complex interplay. The link is there. It's statistically significant in this cohort, and it's definitely worrying. But we need a lot more research to understand why that link exists. It's a major question mark.
Understood. Okay, correlation, not causation. But still, wow, those numbers are high. Let's shift a little to the particles themselves, the size and shape. Did they look different in the different organs?
Yes, they did notice some differences. In the liver and kidney, they tended to see what they described as larger inclusions, sort of in the 1 to 5 micrometer range.
Okay, still tiny, but larger than nano.
Right. But in the brain tissue itself, what they call the parenchyma, they mostly saw much smaller particles, less than 1 micrometer. So we're really talking nanoplastics getting into the main brain tissue.
So the brain seems to be collecting the really, really small stuff.
That's what it looks like, yeah. These nanoparticles, because they're so incredibly tiny, might just behave differently in the body, maybe get past barriers more easily.
Did they get an even closer look, like with high-powered microscopes?
They did. They used transmission electron microscopy, TEM, on the brain samples.
Yeah.
That lets you see things at extremely high magnification. Yeah. And they saw that these nanoplastics were often kind of shard-like or flake-like in shape, and typically about 100 to 200 nanometers long.
Wow. Flakes and shards. And they confirmed they were plastic.
Well, they used another technique, scanning electron microscopy with energy dispersive spectroscopy, semi-ADAS. That basically tells you what elements are present. And it confirmed the particles in all the organs were mainly carbon, which is what you'd expect for plastic polymers.
Okay. And did the researchers have an idea why they might be seeing these smaller individual particles in the brain, but maybe larger clumps in the liver and kidney?
They put forward a hypothesis, yeah. They suggested that maybe these nanoplastics, once they get into the liver and kidney, might tend to clump together or aggregate. That could be why they observe those larger inclusions in those organs.
Interesting. Like the body is trying to package them up somehow in those organs.
Possibly, yeah. It's an idea.
Now, one thing that surprised me a bit was that they didn't find a link with age, right? You might think older people would have accumulated more over their lifetimes.
That's correct. They looked for a correlation between the total plastic concentration in the brain and the age of the person when they died. And they didn't find a statistically significant one.
That does seem a bit weird. Any theories why?
It is counterintuitive, isn't it? The researchers speculate that this might mean that the sheer rate of increase in environmental plastic pollution is maybe a bigger factor right now than just how long someone has lived.
Ah, so because levels are rising so fast, maybe someone younger now is exposed to more than someone older was over a longer period previously.
Kind of, yeah. Or perhaps there's some sort of balance or equilibrium between how much we're exposed to, how much our bodies take up, and maybe how much we manage to clear out. And with current environmental levels being so high, that exposure level might be dominating the equation, more so than just the number of years lived.
That makes a kind of sense, actually, especially thinking about that 50% increase they saw in just 8 years recently.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, if age isn't the main driver, what is dictating who accumulates more? Genetics, lifestyle, exposure routes, lots of questions there.
Definitely. Let's quickly touch on the methods again. You mentioned the GCMS. Were there any, limitations or things they acknowledged about how they did the analysis?
Sure. So the process to get the plastic isolated involved using potassium hydroxide, KOH, digestion, and then ultracentrifugation. They did note there was some variability within a single sample when they ran the analysis multiple times, about a 25% coefficient of variation.
Is that a lot?
It's not insignificant, but they stated it wasn't enough to change their main conclusions about the overall trends or the brain having higher levels.
Okay. And contamination is always a worry with microplastic studies, right? Did they address that?
Oh, yeah, big time. That's crucial. They had lots of quality control steps. They analyzed blank samples that never touched tissue. They carefully checked all the plastic materials used in their lab procedures to make sure they weren't accidentally measuring contamination from, tubes or filters. And they also made the point that the older 2016 samples had actually been stored longer than the 2024 ones, but they had lower plastic levels. That argues against contamination during storage being the main explanation for the increase they saw.
That's a good point. Did they mention any limitations of the study overall, though? Things that future research might improve on?
They did. They mentioned that tiny amounts of leftover biological stuff in the final samples could potentially interfere slightly with the PyGCMS readings. They also thought it was possible they might be slightly underestimating the very smallest nanoplastics, maybe losing some during the spinning, the ultracentrifugation step.
Okay.
And also, they only took one sample from each organ per person, so they couldn't tell if, say, plastic levels might be different in different parts of the brain within the same individual.
Right. So good study, important findings, but still room for refinement in the methods down the line. Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What are the big implications here, and where does the research need to go next?
Well, the big takeaway is this study provides pretty strong evidence for a trend of increasing micro and nanoplastics, especially PE, building up in human organs, most notably the brain, over recent years.
Yeah.
The extremely high levels found in the brain compared to the liver and kidney, and that really striking association with dementia cases, even though it's just an association for. Now, these are major red flags.
Definitely concerning.
But, as we've kept saying, it's crucial to remember these are associated findings right now. We haven't proven that the plastics are causing health problems directly. So our mission was to understand the findings, and we see, yes, they're increasing, particularly in the brain, which leads to the next part. What does it mean for health? And that's where we need more work.
Right. It opens the door for a lot more questions, really.
Absolutely. The researchers themselves call for basically better tools, more refined analytical methods to detect and measure these things even more accurately. They also highlight the niche for more complex studies, maybe tracking people over time to link exposure with health outcomes, and definitely studies with much larger groups of people.
Makes sense.
And given how fast plastic pollution is rising globally, figuring out the potential role these particles might play in things like neurological diseases or other health issues feels pretty urgent. We see them in the brain, mostly PE. But a key question is still how. How are they crossing that protective blood-brain barrier so effectively?
Yeah, that's a huge question. So just to recap our deep dive for everyone listening, the key message from this research seems to be that microplastics, and especially these tiny polyethylene nanoplastics, are definitely accumulating in our brains.
Yep.
The levels look higher in more recent years compared to the past, and they found significantly higher concentrations in the brains of people who had dementia, though we need to be careful about saying what that link means just yet.
That sums it up well. It's clearly a field that's moving fast. And like we discussed, there are still so many fundamental things we don't know. How exactly are we breathing or eating these things in ways that get them into the brain? How do our tissues take them up? Can our bodies get rid of them at all? And the big one, what are the actual long-term health effects, if any?
It really does make you stop and think, doesn't it, about just how much plastic is, well, everywhere in our lives. And if it's accumulating like this, what could that mean down the line, for future generations? It raises questions about what we might need to do individually, maybe societally, about our reliance on plastics. Definitely gives you something to mull over.
It really does. It underlines why continuing this research
Yeah.
and expanding it is just so incredibly important right now.
So for all of you listening, if this topic has grabbed your interest, definitely keep an eye out for future studies. This paper is a significant piece of the puzzle, but it feels like we're really just at the beginning of understanding the whole story between plastics and our health.